Have you ever felt a chill down your spine while walking through a deserted alley, or jumped at an unexplained noise in the dead of night? Ghostly tales lurk in the darkest corners of the world, waiting for those brave enough to uncover them. Welcome to Top 10 Secret, where the most terrifying mysteries come to light. Get ready to face the scariest haunted stories you've never heard before. But be warned, some secrets, once revealed, can never be forgotten. The Landlady. Have you ever thought that a cozy inn could hide terrifying secrets? Billy Weaver, a young man, stops at a small inn on a freezing winter night. But he has no idea he's about to step into a nightmare. Don't forget to like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more thrilling stories. Night had fallen, and the pitch-black sky loomed over the deserted street, where only the howling wind echoed through every crevice. Billy Weaver huddled in his thin coat, the biting cold slicing through the fabric like tiny daggers, making him shiver. He had just arrived in Bath, a town unfamiliar to him after a long and exhausting journey. His legs were numb from the freezing air, and he hurriedly searched for a place to rest. The roadside inns had already closed. The darkness swallowed the path ahead, and only the faint glow of streetlights flickered weakly in the night. Just as despair crept in, Billy's eyes caught sight of a small sign hanging on an old, worn-out wall. Boarding house. A dim, golden light seeped through the window, casting an eerie yet oddly inviting glow. The strangest thing, however, was the front door, slightly ajar, as if waiting for a guest to step inside. Billy hesitated for a moment, but the numbing cold left him no other choice. He reached out and pressed the doorbell. Immediately, the door swung open and an elderly woman appeared. Her face was kind, her smile warm, but something about her deep-set eyes made Billy uneasy. "Welcome, dear. Please come in," she said softly, her tone gentle yet almost too eager. Billy stepped inside, instantly feeling the warmth of the house, but an unfamiliar scent filled his nostrils. A strange mix of flowers and something decayed. The landlady handed him a guest book, asking him to sign his name. As he placed the pen down, his eyes drifted to the names listed before his. Only two: Christopher Mulholland and Gregory Temple. Something about them felt familiar, but Billy couldn't recall why. A sense of unease crawled into his chest, but he quickly brushed it off. It was probably just a coincidence. The landlady smiled, her gaze lingering on him in an odd way. "You're going to love it here," she said. Not as an invitation, but as a certainty. A chill ran down Billy's spine, but he convinced himself he was overthinking. The room she led him to was on the second floor, small but tidy. The furniture was old, its colors faded by time, yet everything was unnervingly well maintained. Hanging on the wall was a framed portrait of two young men, both smiling. Billy frowned. They looked familiar. "They were my previous guests. Handsome, aren't they?" The landlady chuckled, a strange delight in her voice. Billy stared at the painting, a gnawing sense of unease growing inside him. He sat down, his fingers absent-mindedly brushing against the warm teacup the woman had placed before him. He didn't want to drink it, yet something about the heavy silence in the room made him reluctant to refuse. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of an old clock, counting down to something. In the corner of the room, a parrot sat motionless in its cage. At first, Billy thought it was asleep, but upon closer inspection, he realized its eyes weren't blinking. A wave of dread washed over him. The parrot wasn't alive. It had been stuffed. A shiver ran down his spine. His gaze shifted to the floor, where a small dog lay curled near the fireplace. But it didn't move, didn't breathe. Now he understood. Everything in this house was too still, like time itself had frozen. A sickening realization crept in. Billy suddenly remembered where he had seen those names before. Mulholland and Temple. They had been in an old newspaper article. They were missing persons. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, his breath shallow. He turned toward the landlady, about to question her, but the look in her eyes made him stop. Gone was the kindly expression. Instead, her gaze was unreadable, masking something far more sinister. "Is something wrong, dear?" she asked, her voice soft, yet carrying an underlying menace. Billy swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm. He didn't know what awaited him, but one thing was certain. This place was not safe. And perhaps he had made a terrible mistake by stepping inside. The thick darkness swallowed the desolate street, leaving only the eerie sound of the wind howling through the bare trees. Billy Weaver trudged forward, his legs stiff from the freezing cold, his breath turning into thin wisps of smoke that faded into the icy air. He was exhausted after his long journey, and the sharp gusts of wind lashed against his face like tiny blades, making him shudder. Before him, the houses stood silent, no sign of life or light, only an unsettling emptiness. He needed a place to rest, a warm bed for the night before continuing his journey the next morning. Then, suddenly, something caught his eye. A small sign hanging on an old, weathered wall. Boarding house. The sign swayed slightly in the wind, its letters faded with time, yet still legible. What was strange, however, was that while all the other houses were swallowed in darkness, this one glowed with a dim, yellowish light from the window, radiating an unnatural warmth amidst the freezing night. Billy hesitated. Something deep inside him whispered that something wasn't right. But exhaustion and the biting cold drowned out his unease. In the end, he stepped forward, his trembling hand reaching for the doorbell. The moment the chime echoed, the door swung open as if someone had been waiting for him. Standing there was an elderly woman, petite, with pure white hair and bright, almost unnervingly gleaming eyes. Her face was kind, her smile warm, but something about it felt off. It was too wide, too perfect, as if it had been practiced over and over in front of a mirror. "Welcome, dear. Please come in," she said, her voice soft yet strangely eager. Billy blinked, a brief wave of discomfort washing over him, but he quickly shook it off. Stepping inside, he immediately felt the warmth of the house wrap around him, momentarily erasing the cold from his skin. But then, an odd scent hit him. A peculiar mixture of perfume, aged wood, and something else. Something heavier, almost suffocating. His eyes scanned the room. The boarding house was small but well kept, its antique furniture meticulously arranged. Everything seemed too perfect, as if untouched by time. The walls were adorned with floral-patterned wallpaper, slightly faded but still oddly welcoming. "You're looking for a place to stay, aren't you?" the landlady asked, her eyes lighting up with an unsettling excitement. Billy nodded, his fingers unconsciously tightening around his backpack strap. He couldn't explain why, but a strange tension hung in the air, keeping him from fully relaxing. "What perfect timing," the woman continued, her voice almost a whisper as if sharing a secret. "I have one room left, and I simply adore young guests like yourself." Something about the way she emphasized young sent a cold shiver down Billy's spine. He forced a small smile but kept his gaze wary. The landlady led him to a small reception desk in the middle of the living room. A guest book lay open on the polished wooden surface, its pages yellowed with age. "Just sign your name here," she said, sliding the book toward him. Billy picked up the pen, but before writing, his eyes instinctively drifted over the previous names. There were only two: Christopher Mulholland and Gregory Temple. A strange unease stirred in his chest. Those names, they seemed familiar. He had seen them somewhere before, but he couldn't remember where. A faint chill crept up his spine. The landlady watched him closely, her gaze never wavering, as if studying his every movement. "Such lovely boys," she murmured, her voice unnervingly soft, almost as if she were reminiscing. "Just like you." Billy frowned. A vague discomfort slithered through him, growing stronger by the second. But he reassured himself that he was simply overthinking things. He was tired, and his mind was probably playing tricks on him. With a slightly unsteady hand, he signed his name. The moment the pen left the paper, the landlady let out a quiet clap, her smile widening ever so slightly. "There now," she said, her voice laced with an odd satisfaction. "You're part of this place now." Billy's heartbeat quickened. A draft of cold air, one that shouldn't have been possible inside this warm house, brushed against the back of his neck. A deep, unshakable dread settled in his chest. He had stepped into this boarding house. But would he be able to leave? The room was neat and orderly, yet it carried a strange atmosphere, as if it had remained untouched for years. Everything was too tidy, too perfect, and it made Billy feel that something was off. As he set his backpack down on the bed, he instinctively took a deep breath. The scent in the room wasn't just the overly sweet perfume of the landlady. There was something else. A faint, musty odor, damp and stale, like the smell of a room that hadn't been aired out in a long time. Billy let his gaze drift around the room, taking in every detail, until his eyes landed on a framed portrait hanging neatly on the wall. It depicted two young men, their smiles bright, yet their eyes strangely vacant. He narrowed his eyes, trying to remember where he had seen those faces before. Then, like a sudden spark, a realization hit him. They looked eerily similar to the names in the guest book: Christopher Mulholland and Gregory Temple. A shiver ran down Billy's spine. This couldn't be a coincidence. He turned back, only to find the landlady standing right behind him. The sudden proximity made him jump. "Aren't they handsome?" she asked, her voice gentle but carrying an undertone that made Billy uneasy. He forced a smile, trying to mask his discomfort. "They look familiar. I feel like I've seen them somewhere before." The old woman tilted her head slightly, her eyes gleaming in the dim yellow light. "Oh, of course. They were guests of mine too. Such lovely young boys, just like you." Billy didn't know how to respond. He turned away, trying to ignore the creeping sense of unease settling in his chest. But the longer he stayed in this room, the stronger the feeling became. After the landlady left, he sat down in the chair, his gaze unconsciously falling on the rug near the fireplace. That was when he noticed something. A small indentation on the rug's surface, as if something had once rested there for a long time. A fleeting thought crossed his mind, but he quickly dismissed it. It was probably just an old piece of furniture that had been moved. Then, a faint noise came from the corner of the room. Billy stiffened, his head snapping toward the sound. It was the parrot in the cage. He exhaled, relieved, thinking the bird had simply shifted. But as he looked closer, his relief turned to dread. The bird wasn't moving. Its glossy black eyes were wide open, lifeless. Billy stood up abruptly, stepping closer. And that was when he realized the horrifying truth. The parrot wasn't alive. It had been stuffed. His heartbeat thundered in his chest. A sickening fear began to coil in his stomach. But before he could react, his eyes landed on something else. The small dog lying near the fireplace. At first, he had assumed it was just sleeping. But now, he knew better. It wasn't breathing. Slowly, hesitantly, he moved toward it. His hands trembled as he reached out, barely daring to touch it. The dog, too, was stuffed. The air in the room felt heavier, pressing down on him like an invisible force. Billy could feel the blood in his veins turning to ice. He tried to calm himself. Maybe the landlady simply had a peculiar hobby. Maybe she just enjoyed taxidermy. Maybe. But then, an even more terrifying thought crept into his mind. If she had a habit of stuffing her beloved pets, what had happened to Christopher Mulholland and Gregory Temple? Billy knew then. He couldn't stay here. He had to leave. Now. But just as he turned toward the door, a voice whispered behind him. "What's the matter, dear?" Billy froze. The landlady stood in the doorway watching him. Her eyes were as bright as before, but now there was something far more unsettling in them. Billy swallowed hard, struggling to keep his voice steady. I'm just a little tired. I think I should get some rest." The landlady's smile stretched a little too wide, lingering for just a second too long, turning it into something unnatural. "Of course, dear," she cooed. "I want you to feel as comfortable as possible." She stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Billy instinctively backed away, his pulse pounding in his ears. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze never leaving his face. "You know," she murmured, her voice soft yet chilling, "Mulholland and Temple sat in this very spot, right before I kept them forever." Billy's breath hitched. His entire body went cold. Now he was certain. He had to get out of here before he became the next name in the guest book, or the next portrait on the wall. The air in the room thickened, as if the walls were slowly closing in on Billy, trapping him in an invisible cage. The landlady's words echoed in his mind. Mulholland and Temple sat in this exact spot before I kept them forever. Billy couldn't have misheard. She wasn't joking, and she wasn't lying. There was a terrible truth hidden behind that eerie smile, and it sent every nerve in his body into overdrive. He swallowed hard, struggling to keep his panic at bay. His hands instinctively gripped the edge of the table, his palms slick with sweat. "What do you mean, kept them forever?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady, but every word caught in his throat. The old woman tilted her head, her smile unchanging. Her eyes gleamed like glass marbles, reflecting the flickering glow of the dim light. "My dear, I always like to keep my special guests close," she cooed, her voice dripping with an unsettling sweetness. "Can't you see? They're still here, right in this very room." Billy's fingers tightened around the strap of his backpack, every cell in his body screaming at him to run. But he couldn't. His legs felt frozen in place, his fear paralyzing him. His gaze flicked back to the portrait on the wall. Christopher Mulholland and Gregory Temple were still smiling. But now, that smile didn't seem quite right. It looked forced, unnatural, as if it had been trapped beneath layers of paint. Billy's hands trembled. A horrifying realization slashed through his mind. That wasn't a painting. That was them. A cold shudder crawled down his spine. He thought of the parrot, the dog. Everything in this house had been stuffed. And then, the most terrifying thought of all took root in his brain. If she could stuff animals, could she do the same to people? He had to get out. Now Billy took a step back, but before he could move any further, a thin, bony hand reached out and rested lightly on his shoulder. "Don't worry, dear," the landlady whispered, her voice soft but laced with something sinister. "You'll be a part of this place soon enough." Billy's heart pounded so violently that he thought it might burst out of his chest. He yanked his shoulder free, stumbling backward, knocking over a chair with a loud crash. In that instant, her expression changed. The warmth vanished. What remained was a hollow, predatory emptiness, like an animal whose prey had just realized it was being hunted. "You can't leave," she murmured, her voice chillingly quiet. "You're mine now." Billy didn't waste another second. He spun around and lunged for the door, his fingers fumbling desperately with the lock. The door flew open, but he froze. The house was silent. Too silent. The fire no longer crackled in the hearth. The wind had stopped howling outside. The world itself seemed to have gone still. He tore down the staircase, his footsteps echoing unnaturally, as if he were running through a void. The front door loomed ahead, but somehow, it felt impossibly far away. A soft chuckle sounded behind him. "You can't run, Billy." The voice had lost all its earlier sweetness. Now it was cold, empty, like a death sentence. Billy let out a strangled cry, hurling himself at the front door, wrenching at the handle, locked. He twisted the knob, slammed his fists against the wood, but it wouldn't budge. Behind him, footsteps clicked lightly on the floor. "Billy," she whispered, closer now. "I only want you to stay." He spun around, and she was right there. Her wrinkled face was twisted into a grotesque grin, her lips stretched too wide. In her frail hands, she held a small syringe, the liquid inside glinting under the dim light. "Don't be afraid, dear. It'll only hurt for a moment." Billy screamed, thrashing wildly, trying to break free from her grasp. But despite her fragile frame, her grip was inhumanly strong. The cold tip of the needle pressed against his skin. His terror exploded. With one final burst of adrenaline, he shoved her back, hard. She stumbled, but that eerie smile never left her face. Billy didn't think. He couldn't. He bolted toward the window, yanking the curtain aside. Darkness. Nothing but an endless, suffocating blackness outside. But there was no other choice. He took a deep breath and lunged. The glass shattered around him. Then, blackness. Pain shot through Billy's body as he crashed through the window. Shards of glass tore into his arm, a burning sting spreading across his skin. He hit the freezing ground outside, the winter wind slicing against his bloodied flesh like razor-sharp blades. But he had no time to feel the pain. Billy pushed himself up, his legs trembling but still forcing him forward. Inside the house, hurried footsteps echoed. She was coming after him. "Billy ought to come back here, dear." Her voice drifted through the shattered window, sweet yet haunting. Her eyes gleamed in the darkness, hollow and endless, filled with things Billy didn't want to imagine. He screamed, ignoring the searing pain, and sprinted into the night. The road ahead was a blur, the skeletal trees clawing at the sky like the twisted hands of some unseen monster. He didn't know where he was running, only that anywhere was better than staying in that house of horrors. And then he heard it. Footsteps, but not normal ones. No, this was something else. A strange, unnatural movement, as if whatever was following him wasn't entirely human. They fell in slow, deliberate beats, each one closer than the last. A cold breath brushed the back of his neck. Every hair on Billy's body stood on end. He didn't dare turn around. He couldn't. Terror slowed his movements. His legs grew weaker, his lungs tightening as if something unseen was squeezing them. The darkness around him thickened, swallowing him whole. And for just a moment, he felt as if he were slipping into another world, one outside of life itself. Then, a hand, ice cold and unyielding, clamped around his wrist. Billy screamed, thrashing wildly, but the grip was iron strong. His body crashed onto the frost-covered ground, his breath leaving him in sharp gasps. "Billy, don't fight it anymore." Her voice was right next to his ear now, a twisted lullaby of death. Her breath was sickly sweet, carrying a scent both floral and rotten, like wilted flowers left to decay in the dark. He tried to scream, but something unseen constricted around his throat. The world tilted, the air thickening into something almost solid. His vision blurred, his eyelids growing unbearably heavy, as though invisible hands were forcing them shut. No, he couldn't. He had to escape. Summoning every ounce of strength left in his body, Billy bit down hard on her hand. A shriek of pain cut through the night, and for a split second, her grip loosened. That was all he needed. He ripped himself free and bolted forward, adrenaline drowning out every other sensation. The world around him was a dizzying blur, but he didn't stop. He ran until his legs were ready to give out, until his heart threatened to explode inside his chest. Then, suddenly, light. A flickering street lamp glowed through the dense fog, a glimmer of hope in this endless nightmare. Billy staggered toward it, too terrified to look back. But he knew. She was still there, watching him, waiting in the shadows. He could feel her presence, cold, unshakable, clinging to him like a curse. But he had escaped. Or at least, he thought he had. Billy stood under the flickering street lamp, his breath ragged, chest rising and falling as if it were about to burst. He had just escaped that cursed boarding house, fled from the icy grip of the landlady. Or at least, he thought he had. The air around him was thick with an unshakable unease. Under the dim yellow light, he glanced down at his hands. Cuts from the shattered window still oozing blood, his legs scraped raw from his desperate escape. Every wound, every ache in his body was proof that everything that had happened was real. But what terrified him the most was the feeling that something was still following him. He turned his head. The road behind him was empty, swallowed by darkness. The boarding house was far away now, lost in the abyss of night. No one was there. No sounds, no movement. But the feeling remained, that dreadful, unshakable sense of being watched. Billy shivered. He couldn't stay here. Tightening his grip on his backpack, he bit his lip and forced his legs to move. They trembled beneath him, but he had no choice. His footsteps echoed against the empty pavement, the steady rhythm matching the frantic pounding in his chest. The silence around him was unnatural. No distant cars, no rustling wind, nothing but the sound of his own steps. Then, another sound. Footsteps. Not his. Someone, or something, was walking behind him. Billy froze. He stopped moving. The footsteps stopped too. He sucked in a sharp breath, telling himself it was just paranoia, that his mind was playing tricks on him. But then he took another step, and so did it. He stopped again. It stopped again. A cold, electric shock ran down his spine. His heartbeat pounded against his ribs, loud, deafening. He could feel it now, the presence, something unseen standing right behind him. He didn't want to look. He couldn't look. But if he didn't, how would he ever know what it was? His breath hitched. Then, slowly, very slowly, he turned his head. Nothing. Just an empty road stretching into the darkness. But Billy knew, he knew, something was there. His pace quickened. The footsteps behind him quickened too. He started running. The footsteps chased after him, faster, heavier. A cold breath ghosted over the back of his neck, raising every hair on his body. He didn't dare turn around. He just ran, as if stopping meant he'd never get away. Then, a hand, ice cold, gripped his shoulder. Billy screamed, his entire body jolting. He spun around. Nothing, except his shadow. But it wasn't his shadow anymore. It was distorted, twisted, like it belonged to something else. Billy's heart nearly stopped. He stumbled backward, but the shadow clung to the pavement, unmoving. A freezing gust of wind howled past him, but the shadow didn't waver. It just stood there, still, watching him. Then, ever so slowly, the shadow smiled. Billy shrieked and bolted, running blindly anywhere but here. His mind screamed at him to keep going, to get away from whatever the hell that thing was. The wind roared in his ears, and the footsteps behind him grew louder, closer. And then, a voice whispered right next to his ear. "Billy, you think you've escaped?" His body locked up. No, that voice. He knew that voice. Her, the landlady. His breath hitched in sheer terror as he whipped around. No one was there, but his shadow was, and this time, it was moving toward him. Then, darkness. Everything went dark. For a moment, Billy felt nothing. He didn't know if he was standing, sitting, or collapsing to the ground. There was no sound, no light, nothing but an endless void swallowing him whole. He wanted to scream, but his throat was locked tight. An invisible pressure crushed his chest, as if an unseen hand was squeezing the breath from his lungs. His heart pounded, each beat like a drum echoing through this deathly silence. Then, from within the suffocating darkness, a voice emerged. "Billy, I told you, didn't I?" Cold, chilling. The voice rang inside his head, yet it was also right next to his ear, as if she were standing just behind him. He wanted to turn around, but his body refused to move. Suddenly, an icy hand touched his shoulder. Billy jolted, his entire body trembling. He knew it was her. But when he gathered his courage, sucked in a sharp breath, and forced himself to turn around, there was no one there. His breath came in ragged gasps as he stumbled backward, his eyes darting through the pitch-black void. But then he realized. The darkness was moving. It was no longer still. It was alive. The shadows writhed, twisting into unnatural shapes, as if they had minds of their own. Something was forming, emerging from the abyss. Billy tried to run, but his legs wouldn't budge. He looked down, hands. Blackened, twisted hands were rising from the ground, clawing at his ankles, dragging him deeper into the dark. Billy screamed, thrashing wildly. But the more he struggled, the tighter their grip became, razor-sharp nails sinking into his skin. And then, he heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. But this time, they weren't chasing him. They were approaching him. Billy's breath hitched as he lifted his head. A figure emerged from the swirling blackness. Her. The landlady stood before him, her face blurred as if hidden behind a thin veil of mist. But her eyes, her hollow, endless eyes, were painfully clear. Two dark voids pulling him in. She tilted her head, lips curling into a smile. But there was no warmth in it. "Did you really think you could escape, Billy?" He shook his head, tears spilling from his wide, terror-stricken eyes. He didn't want to die. But she only smiled wider, extending her hand toward him. The shadows around them twisted and swirled, forming a massive, churning vortex. Unintelligible whispers echoed through the air, slithering into Billy's mind like parasites burrowing into his skull. Then she whispered her final words. "It's time to come home." The world tilted. The darkness swallowed Billy whole. And then, there was nothing, no sound, no light, nothing but pure, unrelenting terror. And then, it all disappeared. Billy fell. There was no end, no surface to cling to. He just kept falling, sinking into an endless void where the darkness twisted around him like monstrous tendrils, eager to consume him. He tried to scream, but his throat was locked tight. Only his ragged breaths and the furious pounding of his heart echoed in his ears. He didn't know where he was anymore, only that with every passing second, he was plunging deeper into a place he might never escape. Then, something yanked him. An invisible force seized him, dragging him through the abyss as if a giant hand had taken hold of him. The speed increased, faster and faster, until everything around him blurred. Distorted images flashed past, warped faces, shifting shadows, like a nightmare unraveling before his eyes. And then, thud. Billy hit the ground. The impact sent a shockwave through his body, leaving him dazed, but fear forced him to lift his head immediately. His eyes widened. Right in front of him was the boarding house. No. He had escaped this place. He had run away, left it behind, freed himself from her. But now, here he was again, standing right before that familiar cursed building. Everything was exactly as he remembered. The aged, crumbling walls, the fogged-up windows, the heavy wooden door marked with strange scratches. But there was one thing different. The door was open, slowly, creaking, as if it was waiting for him. Billy shook his head violently, his heart hammering against his ribs. Number he couldn't go in. He had to run. But his legs wouldn't move. Frozen in place, an unbearable cold seeped into his bones as he realized he was being pulled inside. The air around him thickened, twisting and constricting, forcing him forward inch by inch. He tried to grasp at anything, but it was useless. Then a whisper slithered into his ears. "Welcome home, Billy." Her. Billy shuddered. That voice slithered into his mind, drenched in a sinister delight, as if she had always known he would return. That escape was never even a possibility. And then, the darkness rushed out from inside the house. A massive wave of blackness engulfed him. Everything vanished. Billy didn't know how long it took for him to open his eyes. But when he did, he was back inside the boarding house. The air in the room was thick, heavy with an unsettling stillness. Everything looked the same, as if he had never left. The old wooden table, the peeling walls, the dust-covered window. But something was wrong. It was too quiet. No distant howling of the wind, no creaking of the wooden floorboards, nothing. An unnatural silence. Billy slowly turned his head, and then he saw himself, another Billy, standing in the middle of the room. It looked like him, but it wasn't. Its eyes were hollow, its lips curled into a distorted, unnatural grin. And then, the shadow of Billy moved. It took a step forward. No sound. Another step. Closer. Another. Billy could feel the icy air radiating from it. And then, ever so slowly, the shadow tilted its head and grinned wider. Too wide. A grin no human could make. Then it whispered, "You belong here now, Billy." Behind him, the door slammed shut. Billy screamed. Darkness swallowed him whole. The door slammed shut. Billy spun around, desperately trying to yank it open, but it was useless. The doorknob was ice cold, frozen solid, refusing to budge no matter how much strength he put into it. His heart pounded, each beat like a hammer striking against his ribs. Footsteps. Slow, smooth. Behind him. Billy froze. He didn't want to turn around, but he had to. He had to face it. His hands trembled as he forced himself to turn his head. And then, he saw it. His duplicate. Standing in the middle of the room, motionless. Empty eyes stared directly at him, as if it were waiting. Then, it smiled. A grin that stretched too far, too wide. So wide it looked as though its face was being ripped apart. "We've switched places." It spoke, its voice light yet echoing with something deeply unsettling. Billy shook his head violently, breath hitching. No, this isn't real. This can't be real." But before he could do anything, the shadow lunged. It happened too fast. It went through him. A frigid chill shot down Billy's spine. He wanted to scream, but he couldn't. A force tugged at him, pulling him out of himself, as if his very soul was being yanked from his body and cast into an endless void. And then, the darkness shattered. Billy collapsed to the floor, coughing, his head spinning. But when he looked up, he saw himself, the shadow now inside his body. It blinked at him with the same eyes, the same face, but it wasn't him. There was nothing behind those eyes. It smiled, software subtle. Then it walked past him toward the door. Billy panicked. "No, don't!" But he couldn't move. He could only watch as the shadow, now Billy, placed its hand on the doorknob and turned it. The door creaked open. Light from outside spilled in. The cold night air rushed into the room. It stepped out and left Billy behind. Billy screamed, throwing himself toward the door, but he couldn't touch it. His hands passed through it. His body went numb. Slowly, he looked down. He wasn't himself anymore. He had become the shadow, cold, invisible, trapped. Billy howled, pounding on the door, but the sound was swallowed by silence. Outside, Billy, the thing that had stolen his body, walked away, vanishing into the world, leaving Billy behind, trapped forever in the boarding house, just like the ones before him, just like the souls who never made it out.